For 8 years, he never spent a single dollar on himself. Every paycheck from his factory job in Canada went straight home to a family that thought he was living a good life abroad. Then one winter morning, without calling anyone, he bought a one-way ticket back. What he found waiting changed everything. His name was Daniel, and before Canada, before the cold winters and the sound of machines, he was just a young man from a small town who woke up every morning to the smell of his mother's cooking and the sound of his father's old radio playing in the background. He was the oldest of 3 children, and in his family, being the oldest meant something. It meant responsibility. It meant that when things got hard, people looked at you first. Things had gotten hard. His father, Isaac, worked as a mechanic fixing cars that barely ran, earning just enough to keep food on the table but never enough to build anything beyond survival. His mother, Ruth, sold vegetables at the local market before the sun came up, her hands rough from years of counting coins and carrying baskets. Daniel watched his parents grow older faster than they should have, tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He watched his younger brother, Peter, dream of becoming an engineer but knew there was no money for that dream to survive past high school. And he watched his wife, Sarah, quietly hold their small family together, never once complaining about the life they didn't have yet, only smiling and telling him that things would get better. So when the opportunity came to move to Canada through a labor program, Daniel didn't think twice. It wasn't excitement that pushed him onto that plane, it was duty. It was love, the kind of love that doesn't announce itself with grand words but simply shows up, packs a suitcase and leaves everything familiar behind for the sake of people who are trusted to be safe while you're gone. The goodbye at the airport was something he would remember for the rest of his life. His mother held his face in her hands the way she used to when he was a boy, and she told him to eat well and take care of himself. His father shook his hand, but his eyes were wet, and he didn't say much because men like Isaac never knew how to put grief into words. Sarah stood there holding their daughter, Abina, who was barely 2 years old and far too young to understand why her father was crying at a place with big loud machines that flew into the sky. Daniel promised them all the same thing before he walked through those doors. He promised that he would work hard, that he would send everything he could, and that this separation would be worth it. Canada was nothing like he imagined. The cold hit him first, a cold that seemed to live inside his bones no matter how many layers he wore. He found work in a meat processing factory on the outskirts of a mid-sized city, standing for 10, sometimes 12 hours a day in freezing rooms, his hands aching by the end of each shift. He shared a small basement apartment with 3 other men from different countries, all of them chasing the same dream in different languages. At night, he would lie on his thin mattress and listen to the pipes groan in the walls, and he would think about home. About the warmth of his mother's kitchen, about the sound of his daughter's laugh, which he could only hear now through a phone screen with a delay that made even laughter feel far away. He made a decision in those first few weeks that would define the next 8 years of his life. He decided that he would live like he had nothing so that his family could have everything. He kept just enough money to survive, rent, basic groceries, a phone plan so he could call home. Everything else, every single dollar beyond the bare minimum, he sent back. He wore the same 3 jackets for years, patching them when they tore instead of buying new ones. He walked to work in temperatures that made his eyes water rather than spend money on transit passes. He ate rice and eggs most nights, sometimes just bread because meat was expensive and he told himself he didn't need it. His coworkers would sometimes invite him out for a drink after a long shift, and he always said no, always found a reason, because a night out cost money that belonged to a house that hadn't been built yet, or a school fee that was due next month. Or medicine his father needed for his blood pressure. Back home, the money did exactly what he hoped it would do. Brick by brick, his family's life began to change. The small, cracked house his parents lived in was slowly rebuilt, room by room, with money he sent every few months. Peter, his younger brother, was able to stay in school and later enrolled in a technical college to study what he'd always dreamed of. His mother stopped selling vegetables at dawn because she no longer needed to. Sarah was able to open a small shop in town, selling clothes and household items, something she had wanted to do for years but never had the capital for. Abina grew up in a home with electricity that didn't flicker, with a real bed, with new shoes for school instead of hand-me-downs. Every video call, Daniel would see these changes. He would see the new roof, the fresh paint, his daughter's growing smile, and for a moment, the cold apartment and the aching hands and the empty stomach would feel worth it. He told himself again and again that a man's greatest joy isn't in what he owns, but in what he gives. But somewhere in those years, in the space between goodbyes and video calls, something in him began to hollow out. He missed Abina's first day of school. He missed Peter's graduation. He missed his own wedding anniversary 3 years in a row, always working overtime because overtime meant more money to send. He missed his father's 60th birthday, watching it instead through a shaky phone camera held up by his brother, seeing the cake, hearing the songs, but feeling like a stranger looking through a window into a life that used to be his. There was a night, deep into his 5th year in Canada, when a coworker named Andre, a quiet man from Haiti who had become one of Daniel's only real friends there, asked him a question that stayed with him for a long time. They were sitting in the factory break room, and Andre looked at Daniel's worn-out gloves and asked him gently, "When was the last time you bought something just for yourself, not for your family, for you?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer and realized he couldn't remember. He laughed it off, said something about how a man doesn't need much, but that night, lying in bed, the question kept circling in his mind like smoke that wouldn't clear. He started noticing things after that, small things he had been too tired, too focused, too far away to notice before. The calls from home began to feel shorter. Sarah's voice, once full of small daily details, funny stories about the shop, things Abina had said, began to feel careful, like she was choosing her words instead of simply speaking them. His mother's voice sounded thinner on the phone, though when he asked if she was all right, she always laughed and said she was just tired from the market, even though she hadn't worked the market in over a year. His father, who used to get on the phone every single call just to say a few words, started missing calls more and more, always resting or out whenever Daniel called. Daniel told himself it was distance. It was time zones. It was the natural fading that happens when a family stretches itself across an ocean for too many years. He held on to that explanation because the alternative, that something was wrong and no one was telling him, was too heavy to sit with while he was thousands of miles away with no way to do anything about it. Then came the week that changed everything. He called home on a Sunday as he always did, and no one answered. He called again that evening and again the next morning before his shift. Nothing. He messaged Sarah, and the message sat there unread for almost 2 full days, which had never happened before, not once in 8 years. When she finally responded, her message was short. She said everything was fine, that they'd been busy, that she would call him soon. But something about the way it was written felt wrong, like it had been typed by someone trying very hard to sound normal. He called Peter, hoping his younger brother would give him something more honest. Peter answered, but his voice was strange, hesitant, full of pauses that didn't belong there. When Daniel asked directly if something had happened to their father, Peter went quiet for a long moment before saying, "He's okay, don't worry, focus on your work." But the way he said it, the speed with which he changed the subject afterward, told Daniel more than the words themselves ever could. For the first time in 8 years, Daniel felt something other than tiredness and duty. He felt fear, cold and sharp, settling into his chest and refusing to leave. Over the next week, small inconsistencies kept surfacing. A neighbor who had recently visited Canada from their hometown mentioned, almost in passing, that Isaac hadn't been seen at the local mechanic shop in months. A distant cousin posted an old photo online with a caption that read like a farewell, something Daniel couldn't quite explain but couldn't ignore either. Every piece on its own could mean nothing. All of them together meant something was being hidden from him, carefully, deliberately, by the people who loved him most. He didn't call anyone to confront them. He didn't send an angry message demanding the truth. Instead, he did something he had never done in 8 years of careful planning and quiet sacrifice. He walked into his manager's office, requested emergency leave, and within 3 days he had used almost all of his personal savings, the small emergency fund he had kept untouched for years, to buy a one-way ticket home. He told no one, not Sarah, not Peter, not his mother. He wanted to walk through that door and see the truth with his own eyes, not hear a version of it prepared for him over the phone. The flight home felt longer than the 8 years that came before it. He sat by the window watching clouds pass beneath him, his mind replaying every phone call, every short answer, every missed detail he had brushed aside because he was too far away to do anything but trust. He thought about all the nights he'd gone without proper meals. All the winters he'd walked instead of ridden, all the birthdays and milestones he'd sacrificed, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the full weight of it, not as a noble sacrifice but as a cost. A real cost that had taken something from him that money could never give back. When the plane landed, the air felt different, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. He didn't call ahead. He took a taxi straight from the airport, watching the streets of his hometown pass by the window, streets that were both exactly as he remembered and strangely unfamiliar, the way home always feels after too many years away. He saw the market where his mother used to sell vegetables before dawn. He saw the school Abina would be attending now, taller than he remembered, freshly painted. And then he saw the house. It stood at the end of the familiar street, and for a moment Daniel simply sat in the taxi and stared at it. It was beautiful. Fully built, with a real roof, painted walls, a small garden out front that hadn't existed before, exactly the home he had spent 8 years imagining, exactly the home his money had built, one transfer at a time. But there was something else. A black ribbon tied quietly around the gate post, small enough that a stranger might not notice it, but unmistakable to a son who knew exactly what it meant. His hands were shaking as he paid the driver and walked toward the door. Before he could knock, the door opened and Sarah stood there, and the moment she saw him, her face broke into something between shock and grief, tears falling before she could even speak. She reached for him and he held her, and over her shoulder he saw his mother rising slowly from a chair inside, older than he remembered, thinner, dressed in mourning black. He didn't need anyone to say the words. He already knew. His father Isaac had passed away almost 3 months earlier after a sudden decline that no one had expected, a heart that simply gave out one evening while he sat listening to his old radio. The family had made a decision in the days that followed, a decision made out of love, though it would take Daniel time to see it that way. They chose not to tell him immediately. They knew that if he heard the news, he would drop everything, spend money he didn't have on an emergency flight, throw away years of stability built on careful sacrifice, all to arrive too late for a funeral that had already happened. So they decided to protect him from a truth that would break him from thousands of miles away, where there was nothing he could do but suffer helplessly. Standing in that house his own hands had built without ever touching a single brick, Daniel felt two emotions collide inside him at once. There was grief, sharp and immediate, for a father he would never speak to again, for a goodbye at an airport 8 years ago that had turned out to be their final real conversation, for all the phone calls he thought he had time to make later. And there was something else too, quieter, harder to name. A strange, aching gratitude for a family who had loved him enough to carry unbearable pain alone just so he wouldn't have to carry it from so far away. His mother took his hands that evening, the same way she had at the airport 8 years before, and told him something he would never forget. She said that his father had spent his final months walking through the new rooms of that house, touching the walls, telling anyone who would listen that his son had built this with nothing but sweat and love, that he was the proudest father in the world, even if he never got the chance to say it directly to Daniel's face. She told him that Isaac's last request had been simple. He didn't want his son rushing home in grief, throwing away years of sacrifice for a funeral. He wanted Daniel to finish what he started, and to come home only when he was ready to stay for the right reasons. That night, Daniel sat outside the new house long after everyone else had gone to sleep, looking up at a sky that felt both familiar and impossibly distant. He thought about all the years he had spent believing that his sacrifice was measured only in money sent and comforts denied. He realized now that sacrifice had another side he never fully understood, the sacrifice of those left behind, the burden his family carried in silence so that his own burden would feel lighter. He decided in the quiet of that night that he would not return to Canada. 8 years was enough. He had built the house his family needed, educated the brother who needed an education, given his wife the foundation to build her own dreams, and given his daughter a childhood free of the hardship he once knew. But somewhere in all that giving, he had almost lost the very reason he was giving in the first place, the chance to simply be present, to be there for birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays and quiet dinners that meant nothing and everything at once. In the months that followed, Daniel used what remained of his savings to start a small business at home, working alongside Peter, who had finished his technical training and was eager to build something with the brother who had made his education possible. Sarah's shop grew steadier now that she had a partner beside her instead of a voice on a phone screen. Abina, now old enough to understand more of the world, would sit beside her father in the evenings, and he made a quiet promise to himself that he would never again let a milestone pass by unnoticed, watched only through a delayed video call from a cold country far away. He visited his father's grave often in those first months, sometimes just to sit, sometimes to talk the way he used to on those Sunday calls, as though distance had simply changed shape rather than disappeared. He told his father about the business, about Abina's growing height, about small things that once felt too ordinary to matter, but now felt like the entire point of coming home. There is a lesson buried in stories like this one, a lesson that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles quietly into the heart of anyone willing to listen. Sacrifice given out of love is never wasted, even when it costs more than we expect, even when it takes things from us we didn't know we were losing. But love also asks us to remember that presence matters as much as provision, that a house built from far away can shelter a family's body, but it cannot replace the warmth of a hand held during hard moments, the comfort of simply being there when it counts most. Daniel gave his family everything he had for 8 long years, and in the end what he learned to give them next, the gift of simply staying, of being present for the small, unremarkable days that make up a real life together, turned out to be the most valuable gift of all. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the sacrifices someone in your own life has made quietly without asking for recognition, take a moment today to tell them. Don't wait for silence to speak the truth for you.